What if I told you there's a car that could outmaneuver a London taxi in the tightest streets of Britain, yet it only had 60 horsepower? Picture this. It's 1961, and you're trying to parallel park on a cramped London street where spaces are measured in inches, not feet. The car ahead is too close. The car behind is practically kissing your bumper, and there's a queue of impatient drivers behind you. Then you see it. A Triumph Herald slides into an impossible gap with a single elegant sweep of the steering wheel. No backing up, no three-point turn, just one smooth motion that defies the laws of automotive physics. The driver steps out with a knowing smile, while everyone else is still figuring out how that just happened. This is the story of the 1961 Triumph Herald, a car that proved you don't need thunderous horsepower or racing pedigree to revolutionize urban driving. While American manufacturers were locked in horsepower wars and building cars the size of small boats, British engineers at Standard Triumph were solving a different problem entirely. They weren't asking how fast a car could go. They were asking how a car could navigate the medieval street layouts of European cities that were never designed for automobiles. The answer they came up with would embarrass vehicles with 3 times the power and challenge everything the industry thought it knew about what made a car practical. To understand why the Herald was revolutionary, we need to travel back to Britain in the late 1950s. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had sent fuel prices soaring. Petrol rationing was still fresh in everyone's memory. British cities were recovering from wartime bombing, but the street layouts remained largely unchanged since horse-drawn carriages ruled the roads. These weren't the wide boulevards of Paris or the grid systems of American cities. These were narrow, winding streets built centuries before anyone imagined the automobile. Parking spaces were afterthoughts squeezed between Victorian buildings. Multi-point turns were a daily ritual of urban driving. The British motor industry was producing sensible, economical cars, but they all shared the same fundamental problem. The Morris Minor, Austin A40, and Ford Popular, competent cars all, had turning circles ranging from 33 to 37 feet. That meant a 3-point turn in most situations, sometimes 5-point turns in really tight spots. The London Black Cab, specifically designed for city work, managed 25 feet 6 inches. That was considered the gold standard of maneuverability. Engineers assumed you couldn't do better without compromising stability or safety. Standard Triumph was in trouble. Their previous small car, the Standard 8 and 10, was outdated and selling poorly. They needed something revolutionary to compete with the British Motor Corporation's stronghold on the small car market. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of trying to beat BMC at their own game, Standard Triumph's engineers, led by Harry Webster and Italian stylist Giovanni Michelotti, decided to completely rethink what a small car could be. The engineering team started with a radical proposition. What if they could match or beat the London taxi's turning circle in a proper passenger car? The conventional wisdom said it was impossible. You needed a certain wheelbase for stability. You needed adequate tire clearance. You needed suspension geometry that wouldn't cause the car to flip over in tight turns. But Webster's team approached the problem from first principles. They questioned every assumption about car design. The foundation of the Herald was its separate chassis construction. While most manufacturers were moving toward unibody construction for cost savings, Standard Triumph chose a backbone chassis with outriggers. This wasn't about being old-fashioned. This was strategic brilliance. The chassis gave them complete freedom with suspension design and body mounting. Every body panel was bolted on, not welded. You could literally unbolt and remove any damaged panel with basic hand tools, a revelation for repair shops and home mechanics alike. Now here's the kicker. The front suspension used upright coil springs with wishbones, completely independent, which was still relatively uncommon in 1961 for economy cars. But it was the steering geometry that was truly revolutionary. The Herald's engineers achieved an unprecedented 45-degree steering lock. Let that sink in for a moment. Most modern cars manage 30 to 35 degrees before the tires hit the wheel wells. The Herald's front wheels could turn almost perpendicular to the car's direction of travel. This extreme steering angle was possible because of meticulous packaging. The engine was set back slightly. The front wheel wells were shaped to provide maximum clearance at full lock. The rack and pinion steering, another feature unusual for small British cars of the era, provided precise, direct control. Every millimeter of space was optimized. The result? A turning circle of exactly 25 feet. Not 25 feet 6 inches like the London taxi, 25 feet flat. The Herald could literally outturn a purpose-built taxi. But wait, there's more. The rear suspension was where things got really interesting and controversial. The Herald used swing axles with a transverse leaf spring. This wasn't cutting-edge technology. Swing axles had been around since the 1930s. But in the Herald's case, this simple, cost-effective solution provided fully independent rear suspension. Every wheel could move independently over bumps and through turns. In 1961, most small cars still had solid rear axles that kept both wheels rigidly connected. The swing axle design was elegant in its simplicity. Each rear wheel was attached to a half shaft that pivoted from the differential. A single transverse leaf spring ran across the car, supporting both sides. When one wheel hit a bump, it could move up without affecting the other wheel. This gave the Herald a remarkably smooth ride for such a small car. The suspension soaked up cobblestones and rough British B-roads that would have rattled occupants in competing vehicles. Under the hood was a 948cc four-cylinder engine. The power plant was derived from the standard 8 engine, but thoroughly modernized. Overhead valves, not side valves like some competitors still used. The compression ratio was 8.5.1, respectable for the era when many small cars ran 7.1 or lower. The engine breathed through a single Solex carburetor, precisely jetted for economy rather than performance. Maximum power came at 5,000 RPM, 60 horsepower. Maximum torque of 51 pound-feet arrived at 3,000 RPM. Now 60 horsepower might sound laughable today. A modern Honda Civic makes nearly 3 times that. But context is everything. The Herald weighed just 1,764 pounds. That's lighter than a modern Mazda MX-5 Miata. The power-to-weight ratio wasn't about winning drag races. It was perfectly matched to British driving conditions, enough to maintain 50 mph on motorways, sufficient to climb steep hills in second gear, ideal for stop-and-start city traffic, where you rarely exceeded 30 mph anyway. The 4-speed manual gearbox had synchromesh on the top 3 gears. First gear was unsynchronized, but the ratios were perfectly spaced for city driving. First gear was low enough to climb San Francisco steep hills fully loaded. Fourth gear was tall enough to cruise economically at highway speeds. The gear lever was mounted on the floor, not on the column like many British cars of the era, giving a more sporting feel despite the modest power output. But the real magic happened when you combined all these elements. The tight turning circle meant you could make U-turns where other cars needed 3-point turns. The independent suspension meant you could take those tight turns without the body roll that plagued cars with solid axles. The rack and pinion steering gave you millimeter precision when threading through narrow gaps. The excellent visibility from the large glass area and thin pillars meant you could see exactly where your corners were. Standard Triumph's testing revealed something extraordinary. Professional drivers could parallel park the Herald in spaces just 14 inches longer than the car itself. That's not a typo. 14 inches of total clearance, 7 inches front and rear. The extreme steering lock allowed drivers to swing the nose in at acute angles impossible in other cars. The lightweight and precise steering meant You could nudge into spaces by feel. Test drivers reported parking in spaces that looked physically impossible from the outside. The Herald's body design by Michelotti was clean and modern, but every line served a purpose. The front wings were separate panels bolted to the main structure. If you pranged one in a tight parking maneuver, you could unbolt it and replace just that panel. The bonnet was a massive forward-hinged unit that opened to reveal the entire front suspension and engine. You could literally sit on the front tire while working on the engine, unheard of accessibility for the era. The doors were particularly clever. They opened to nearly 90 degrees, despite the Herald's narrow width. The front door apertures were designed to allow easy entry, even when parked tight against a wall. The door handles were recessed to avoid catching on passing vehicles in narrow streets. Even the bumpers were designed for city combat, simple chrome-plated steel bars that could take minor impacts without expensive damage. Inside, the Herald offered surprising sophistication for an economy car. The dashboard featured a full set of instruments: speedometer, fuel gauge, temperature gauge, and oil pressure gauge. Many competitors made do with just speedo and fuel. The steering wheel was a proper three-spoke design, not the massive bus wheel common in small cars. The seats were individual buckets up front, not a bench, giving better lateral support in those tight turns. The heating system was remarkably effective for a British car of the era. The heater matrix was large, and the fan actually moved meaningful amounts of air. The demisting vents actually cleared the windscreen in British winter conditions, a claim many British cars couldn't make. These weren't luxury features, but practical necessities for year-round urban driving in Britain's challenging climate. Production began at Standard Triumph's Canley factory in Coventry in 1959, with the 1961 model year bringing refinements based on early customer feedback. The assembly process was unique. Because of the separate chassis and bolt-on panels, Herald production was incredibly flexible. Different body styles could run down the same production line. Workers could easily customize cars for export markets with different specifications. The modular construction also meant that damaged cars could be rebuilt rather than scrapped. The Herald came in multiple variants. The basic saloon was joined by a convertible version that was remarkably affordable. The estate version offered surprising cargo capacity in a compact footprint. There was even a van version for commercial use. But the masterstroke was the coupe model, which used the same mechanicals but looked like a miniature grand tourer. All versions shared that remarkable 25-foot turning circle. The motoring press was initially skeptical. How could a car with such an extreme steering angle be stable? Wouldn't the swing axles cause dangerous handling? Road tests quickly silenced the doubters. Autocar magazine achieved 73 mph flat out and recorded 0-60 mph in 30.9 seconds. Not quick, but perfectly adequate for British conditions. More importantly, they averaged 38.9 miles per gallon in mixed driving, with careful drivers seeing over 40 miles regularly. The handling drew particular praise for city driving. The steering required just 2.5 turns lock to lock, compared to 4 or more in many competitors. The turning circle wasn't just a party trick, it transformed daily driving. Testers reported completing U-turns in narrow residential streets where they'd previously needed multiple backing maneuvers. Parallel parking became almost effortless. The Herald could navigate medieval town centers that challenged much smaller cars. But here's where things get technically fascinating. The swing axle rear suspension, while brilliant for ride comfort and packaging, had an inherent characteristic that would later become controversial. Under extreme cornering, swing axles can experience jacking, where the outside wheel tucks under the car, potentially causing instability. However, at the Herald's performance level and with its intended use pattern, this was rarely an issue. Urban speeds and the car's light weight meant the suspension operated well within its comfort zone. Standard Triumph's engineers had actually anticipated this. The Herald's swing axles had carefully calculated pivot points and spring rates. The geometry was designed to minimize camber change through the suspension travel. The rear track was slightly wider than typical for swing axles, improving stability. The transverse leaf spring provided natural roll stiffness. In normal driving, even enthusiastic normal driving, the Herald was predictable and safe. The Herald found its perfect environment in British cities. In London, Herald owners reported dramatically reduced parking stress. They could fit into spaces that defeated larger cars. The tight turning circle meant fewer three-point turns, reducing traffic disruption. The excellent visibility and precise steering made navigating narrow streets almost enjoyable. The economical running costs, 40 km/h, cheap insurance, minimal maintenance, made it perfect for young professionals and small families. But the Herald's influence extended beyond Britain. Export models were sent across Europe, where medieval city centers presented similar challenges. In Italy, Herald owners could navigate hill towns that challenged Fiat 500s. In France, the Herald could thread through Parisian traffic with aplomb. Even in countries that produced their own small cars, the Herald offered something unique, that combination of maneuverability, practicality, and repairability. The separate chassis construction proved invaluable in developing markets. In Australia, local coach builders created unique variants. In India, Standard Motor Products of India built Heralds with locally sourced components. The bolt-on panels meant damaged cars could be repaired with basic tools and skills. This wasn't just about first-world convenience. It was about creating a truly global car that could be maintained anywhere. Production continued through 1971 with continuous improvements. Later models received the 1147C engine, producing 68 horsepower. The gearbox gained synchromesh on all forward gears. The interior was updated with better seats and improved ventilation, but the fundamental formula remained unchanged. That remarkable turning circle, the independent suspension, the practical bolt-on construction. By the time production ended, over 500,000 Heralds had been built. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The Herald had proven that innovation didn't always mean more power or higher speeds. Sometimes innovation meant solving real problems that affected millions of drivers every day. The Herald made city driving less stressful, more economical, and surprisingly enjoyable. The technical legacy of the Herald is often overlooked. That 45-degree steering lock remains exceptional even by modern standards. Today's cars can't match it because of wider tires, complex suspension geometries, and the need to package larger engines and crash structures. Modern power steering might make turning easier, but it hasn't made turning circles tighter. A 2024 Volkswagen Golf has a turning circle of 35.8 feet. A Honda Civic needs 36.1 feet. Even the tiny Smart 4.2, specifically designed for city use, manages only 22.8 feet, still not matching the Herald from 1961. The Herald's influence on chassis design was profound. It demonstrated that separate chassis construction could offer advantages in certain applications. While unibody construction dominated mass production, specialist manufacturers took note. Kit car manufacturers adopted Herald chassis for their flexibility. Restoration specialists appreciated how easily damaged Heralds could be rebuilt. The modular approach influenced everything from the original Range Rover to modern electric vehicle platforms. The swing axle suspension, despite its limitations, proved that independent rear suspension could be affordable and effective. While later cars moved to more sophisticated designs like McPherson struts and multi-link systems, the Herald had shown that independent rear suspension wasn't just for luxury cars. It paved the way for the universal adoption of independent suspension that we take for granted today. Think about what the Herald really represented. In an era obsessed with power and speed, it championed maneuverability and practicality. While others were adding cylinders and carburetors, standard Triumph was perfecting steering geometry and suspension design. The Herald proved that solving everyday problems could be just as innovative as setting speed records. It showed that 60 horsepower was plenty if every other aspect of the car was optimized for its intended use. The Herald's story is a reminder that automotive innovation isn't always about pushing boundaries of speed or power. Sometimes it's about making daily life better for ordinary people. Those Herald owners navigating narrow British streets in 1961 didn't care that their car couldn't win drag races. They cared that they could park outside their flat, make that tight turn into their garage, navigate that medieval town center without drama. The Herald delivered exactly what they needed. Modern automotive engineers could learn from the Herald's focused approach. In our era of 300 horsepower hot hatches and SUVs the size of small houses, we've lost something. We've forgotten that maneuverability matters, that repairability has value, that not every problem needs a high-tech solution. The Herald solved its problems with clever packaging, thoughtful engineering, and a clear understanding of what customers actually needed versus what marketers thought they wanted. The survivors, those Heralds still on the road today, are testament to the design's fundamental rightness. Triumph clubs worldwide maintain fleets of Heralds that still deliver that unique driving experience. Owners report that even 60 years later, the Herald's party tricks still amaze. Parallel parking remains effortless. U-turns still embarrass modern cars. The steering feel, unassisted and direct, provides feedback that's been filtered out of modern vehicles. These aren't just classic cars being preserved for nostalgia. They're still doing exactly what they were designed to do, making city driving manageable and even enjoyable. Looking forward, as cities become more congested and parking spaces more precious, the Herald's philosophy becomes more relevant, not less. Electric city cars are rediscovering the importance of maneuverability over raw performance. Automated parking systems are trying to replicate what Herald drivers could do manually. The Herald's 25-foot turning circle remains a benchmark that few modern cars can match, despite 6 decades of supposed progress. The 1961 Triumph Herald stands as proof that true innovation isn't always about having the most of something, the most power, the most speed, the most technology. Sometimes innovation means having exactly enough of everything, perfectly balanced for a specific purpose. The Herald had enough power for British roads, enough sophistication for daily use, enough durability to last decades, and more maneuverability than anyone thought possible. It showed that 60 horsepower and swing axles weren't limitations to overcome, but tools to be optimized. The Herald reminds us that the best engineering solutions often come from questioning fundamental assumptions. Why accept a 35-foot turning circle when 25 feet was possible? Why weld body panels when bolting them on made more sense? Why compromise city maneuverability for highway stability that most drivers rarely needed? The Herald's engineers asked these questions and created something remarkable, a car that was perfectly adapted to its environment, revolutionary in its normalcy, and brilliant in its simplicity. What's the tightest parking space you've ever managed to squeeze into? Could you do it in a single maneuver like Herald owners could? Drop a comment below about your urban driving challenges and whether you think modern cars have lost something important in the pursuit of ever more power and technology. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into an engineering marvel that changed city driving forever, hit that subscribe button for more stories of automotive innovation that solved real problems in unexpected ways. Until next time, remember, sometimes the best engineering isn't about going faster. It's about turning tighter.